Hi guys, I'm just going to be explaining the all or none law in a little bit more depth for you because I know that it's a little bit of a difficult concept to sort of wrap your head around. So in our lesson, we kind of talked about the fact that for muscles to contract, a nerve impulse must be received from a stimulus, and it must be sufficient enough to activate at least one motor unit. Okay, and once this motor unit is activated, the muscle fibers within that motor unit will then contract, producing a muscle twitch which causes your movement. Okay, and these muscle fibers in the motor unit will either respond at 100%, which is your all, or at 0%, which is your none. Okay, so looking at this in a little bit more depth, um, when I talk about a motor unit, this picture here is what I'm speaking about. Okay, so it's your nerve, which is connected to your muscle fibers via an axon. Okay, so the nerve to the axon to where it connects to your muscle fibers, this whole sort of process here is known as a motor unit. Okay, so again, thinking about our previous slide, it's the stimulus that causes that nerve impulse to happen, and that nerve impulse travels from the nerve through the axon, if you're following the red line, into your muscle fibers. Okay, this causes the activation of your motor unit. So this nerve impulse that travels through the axon here causes the activation of this whole motor unit here. Okay, this then causes your muscle fibers here to contract, which creates your movement. All right, so activation of motor units, as we've previously said in this last slide here, they will respond at 100% or at 0%. Okay, so there is no in between. All right, so if you receive a nerve impulse and the motor units that receive this nerve impulse, all of their muscle fibers, everything in that process will activate at 100%. They will give it their absolute all. Okay, only the motor units that receive this nerve impulse activate at 100%. Okay, they don't activate at 50, they don't activate at 25, 10, 70, whatever it may be, it's 100%. Okay, and then for the motor units that don't receive the nerve impulse, they are inactive. Okay, they're at 0%. There is nothing happening in those motor units. Okay, it's only the ones that receive the nerve impulse. Okay, which then causes the muscle fibers to contract and the movement to occur that we need. So, if we have a look in terms of force, obviously different movements need different types of force. Like, for example, if I were to pick up a pen, I would need a lot less force to do that than if I were to try and pick up a 20 kilogram weight. Okay, so it's completely dependent on the force that we need to produce, which is how many motor units that we use. So if we have a look at the example I've got on the board here, I've sort of gone into jumping and walking, and say for example in our gastrocnemius, not 100% sure if this is exactly how many we have, but just as an example for you guys, I've said that there are 1,000 motor units in your gastrocnemius. Okay, so there are 1,000 of these in your gastrocnemius muscle, which is where your calf muscle is. All right, so if we have a look at jumping and walking, for jumping you need a lot more force than you do for walking. Okay, so because you need more force for jumping, it means you're going to need more motor units. You're going to need more of these guys to be activated to be able to produce the jump movement that you want. Okay, for walking, of course, there's less force, which means that there would be less motor units. So there's less of these guys here that will be activated because you don't need that many to produce the movement you need. And this is because, again, when they're activated, they're either activated at 100% or they're not activated at all. So if you activated the same amount of motor units you did when you jump to when you walk, okay, there wouldn't be too much difference. It would more end up being a run than a walk because you're using a lot more force than you would actually need to. Okay, so if we say, for example, with jumping, the force that you need from your gastrocnemius, you need maximum force from the motor units in your gastrocnemius to perform this movement. In that case, because I've given the example that in our gastrocnemius there is 1,000 motor units, the maximum force, okay, that would need to be produced would then have to activate all 1,000 motor units. Okay? Whereas if for walking, because you don't need that maximum force, you may only need 50% sort of roughly, because these motor units act at 100%, only 500 of those 1000 motor units would be activated at 100%. The other 500 would be at 0% inactive because you don't need that extra force from those motor units. Okay, so just to reiterate, jumping, you need a lot more force, which means you would need a lot more motor units, so a lot more of these guys. And if it's at maximum force, it would be every single motor unit in that muscle that would be activated at 100% to create that movement. Whereas for something that needs a little less force, like walking, you would need less of these guys, so less of these motor units to be activated. So the nerve impulses would only sort of recruit half or less, depending on how fast you were walking. It would only need to recruit half of those motor units to contract those muscle fibers to produce that force at 100%. Because there's less motor units that have been activated, that creates the less force.